In this episode of B.Hooked Crochet, we're going to crochet the Zig Zag puff stitch. My name is Brittany and I'll be your guide throughout this tutorial. For a supplies list and for written instructions, please visit bhookedcrochet.com/zigzagpuff. Let's get started. The Zig Zag puff stitch, or the slanted puff as it's sometimes referred to, it works in a multiple of 3 plus 3. So that means you need to create a foundation chain that's a multiple of 3 and then add 3 chains to the end of that. So of course you want to start off with your slip knot. And before we make any chains, the one thing that you're going to need to keep in mind is that puff stitches are, of course, very puffy. So they have a tendency of stretching your work out. And because of that, we need to make sure our foundation chain is crocheted more loose than what you normally would. So typically I would pull my slip knot all the way up to my hook, but I'm actually going to let it out a little bit. I want to make my chains pretty loose. Now for this demonstration, I'm going to chain 12 and then I'm going to add 3 to that. So I'm going to chain 15. I encourage you to make a swatch of this before you actually dive into a project. That way you can get your tension and all of that stuff squared away. So once you have your foundation chain, if you're working alongside of me, I have 15 chains here. I'm going to skip 2 chains. That's going to act as a half double crochet. Then I'm going to skip the third one. That's just going to be an open chain for now. I want to find that 4th chain and work a double crochet into it. Now, in order to get our puff stitches to slant, we're actually going to be crocheting them crisscross from our double crochets, and we're working around the double crochet, so this is going to add to the puffiness of the stitch. So point your attention to the chain that we skipped. So it's actually the 3rd chain. It's a little bit different on this edge here because we're just starting out, but find that chain that's right next to your double crochet. And we're going to work a puff stitch into that chain. So when you insert your hook into the chain, you'll come just right back out the other side. And then you can yarn over, pull up a loop, and then pull that up real far. This is going to be the height of your puff stitch, and so you want them to be uniform. Then you'll yarn over, insert your hook into that same chain, and pull up a loop. Do the same thing where you pull it up real nice and far, and then do that one more time. So puff stitches can come in any variety, honestly. Depends on the yarn that you're using. So I'm using a bulky weight roving style yarn. So this yarn is naturally very fluffy, so I don't have to create as big of a puff stitch. What I have here is a puff stitch with 7 loops. And that's okay for this yarn, but if you're working with a worsted weight yarn, I would recommend going one more time. So yarn over, insert your hook in the stitch, and do so until you have 9 loops on your hook. That's going to give you a better shape for your puff stitch. So once you have your puff stitch the size that you want it, you'll yarn over, pull through all the loops on your hook, and then you'll chain 1 to secure it. Now that chain 1 doesn't really count as a stitch. It's actually part of the puff stitch in order to seal everything up. But these are important because we're going to be working stitches into them later. Next we want to skip the next chain and then work a double crochet into the next. Then we're going to locate that chain that we just skipped, and we're going to puff stitch into that space, into that chain. Now you'll skip the next chain, double crochet into the next, and at this point we found our repeat. So we're just going to repeat this until we get to the end of the row. So once you've made it to the end of your row, you should have one chain remaining after you finish that puff stitch. And what we want to do is half double crochet into that stitch. And this is just going to give us a nicer edge, a cleaner edge on the side here. Plus it's going to match what we have over here where we had those 2 chains that counted as a half double crochet. Now to begin our second row, we're going to chain 2. That's going to count as a half double crochet. We'll turn our work. We want to focus our attention on this space right here. So I mentioned before that we were going to be working stitches into the chain that finishes off our puff stitch. So just find that first puff stitch, and then if you just look right next to it, you'll see that stitch that finishes it off. We'll double crochet there. And then we want to work our puff stitch into this space here. So this part is really just a repeat. We're not changing anything as far as the stitch pattern goes, but just building upon this next row. It's kind of what we're focusing on here. So you'll finish your puff stitch, then you'll find the gap between the next 2 puff stitches, and then locate that same stitch. That's where we're going to double crochet, and then puff stitch in the space just behind it. And you're just going to simply repeat that until you get to the end of your row. Then we'll talk about how to finish off the row. So that way we don't increase or decrease, and we have the straightest edges as possible. So once you've reached the end of your row, I've stopped here just a little bit short so I can show you where we're going to work our last puff stitch. So this part is the same. We're going to find that space. That's where the puff stitch is going to go. And we just want to find that stitch for our double crochet. And then puff stitch in the space behind it. Chain 1 to finish it off. Now if we were to just stop here, as you can see, we wouldn't have straight edges. So we would have kind of a jagged edge as we go, and eventually it would decrease to the point where it didn't exist anymore. It would just keep decreasing until you had no stitches left. The reason for that is because we're offsetting our puff stitches. So rather than working on top of each other like we would traditionally, we're working in between. And in order to make things as easy as possible to keep the same pattern repeat, what we need to do to finish off this row is find our turning chain, which I have right here. I'm going to locate that top turning chain, and I'm going to half double crochet into that turning chain. Now that is going to make sure that we have straight edges as we work back and forth, but we're also not decreasing or increasing our number of stitches. So one thing that you want to keep in mind as you're working up your project, if you're having problems with the edges, just pay attention to how many puff stitches you have. So you can see we have 6 puff stitches in this little swatch. So on the first row we have 6 puff stitches. On the second row we have 6 too. If you have 5 or if you have 7, or if your number is off by 1, of course you're increasing or decreasing. So to proceed with row 3, it's exactly the same. You're just going to chain 2, turn your work, and you're going to point your attention to this space here. That's where we're going to make the first puff stitch, and then we'll double crochet right here. Now puff stitch behind. Now as you can see, since we have that extra row, we've sort of filled in that little gap, and so it's going to look a little better. So you're just going to repeat this simple 1-row repeat until your project reaches the desired length. And just one other little piece of advice about puff stitches. So puff stitches are beautiful, but they have a tendency to be kind of a pain. Because of the nature of how they're worked, how we're pulling up our strands in order to create the puff, if you have any variability in how far you pull them up. So let me get to that space here. If on one round you're just pulling to here, or excuse me, if you're on one row, you're just pulling to here, then your puff stitch is going to be shorter. So wherever your hook ends is how tall your puff stitch is going to be. So that's fine if you're consistent throughout your project. But in most cases, bigger puff stitches look better than shorter ones. So I just have a tendency to pull my hook up all the way so it's at the same level of the rest of the work. So I'm really exaggerating that stitch. And so that's why this stitch just takes a lot of practice. You just have to make sure you're consistent. The other thing with puff stitches is that they look better on the front side than they do the back side. And since we're working this in rows where we go back and forth, we're going to have one row that just doesn't look quite as good as the other ones. So you can see this one looks pretty good. I'm just going to pull up on this. Finger blocking goes a long way in terms of puff stitches. So they naturally want to puff kind of backwards. So I'm working, this is the right side of my work. They're wanting to go out the back. But since this is the front, I want them to puff out. So I'm just going to take my fingers and just push them out. Now what you can do on this wrong side row, so this is the wrong side of the puff stitch, is just take and finger block them too. I kind of pull out on these two strands that just tend to stick out in the way. So I'm just going to pull out on those just to help it to puff out in this direction here. So now, of course, I've reached the end of the row. I have my 6 puff stitches. So I don't want to add any more. I want to make a half double crochet into my turning chain. So if you're having problems locating that chain, a stitch marker goes a long way. You can use a stitch marker and place it into your second chain. That way you can see it when you go back around. Now that wraps up our demonstration today on the zigzag puff or the slanted puff stitch. It's a really cool stitch that's usable for lots of different projects. And so again, for the written instructions, you'll visit BHookedCrochet.com/zigzagpuff.